then more individuals will join as we go. So hello, everyone. Welcome to the Yale School of Management session at the GMAT Club application walkthrough event. My name is Braden Walters, and I'll be your host for this session. Joining us today is the Assistant Dean for Admissions at the Yale School of Management, Laurel Grodman. During this session, Laurel is going to walk us through Yale's MBA application process, share practical tips on how we can put together the strongest application possible. After the walkthrough, we'll jump into a Q&A session. Please use the chat to submit your questions. And if you see some questions in there that you like, give them a thumbs up and we'll address those at the end if we have time. You'll also have time to come off, hopefully at the end of camera and ask a few questions if you raise your hand at the end after the presentation. So without further ado, let's get after it. The floor is yours, Laurel. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Braden. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us from. Once again, my name is Laurel Grodman. I'm Assistant Dean for Admissions at the Yale School of Management. And even more importantly, I'm also a member of the Yale SOM class of 2006. So I'm excited to get to spend the next 45 or so minutes with you talking about a little bit up front, just our general application philosophy. Then we'll spend the bulk of the time. I'll open up the app and go through some of the specific parts, particularly some of the things that are not always covered in application panels and other sorts of events. And then, as Braden said, we'll leave some time for Q&A at the end. So hopefully I'll have an opportunity to answer lots of your questions throughout. So if you wouldn't mind just holding those questions until the end, and we can be sure to cover anything that's still on your mind. So, we have so many great resources to talk about the school and the Yale School of Management's mission and values. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that here today. I want to leave as much time as possible to focus on the application. But the most important thing to know about the Yale School of Management is that our mission is to educate leaders for business and society. And it means that we aim to develop leaders who can think broadly about the challenges that we face in an increasingly complex world and who have the tools to find integrated and interdisciplinary and cross-sector solutions to our most pressing problems and opportunities. And it's really our desire to bring students together who will benefit the most from this kind of education. And that's what underlies our entire application process. So before I open up the application itself, I'll share a few words about the philosophy behind our approach to the application and how we in admissions evaluate candidates, which I hope will frame our walkthrough in some useful ways. So at a high level, what we're looking for throughout your application is really three primary things. We're looking for your academic potential. We want to make sure that we're admitting people who are set up to thrive in an academically rigorous program. We're looking for evidence of your professional impact, so how you've both led and collaborated in the professional environments that you've been a part of, and how you contribute to the communities that you're a part of, how you operate and interact with those communities and organizations, because we want to bring you into the LSOM community and the communities and organizations that you join beyond in a way that is going to take most advantage of our mission. And so everything that we ask you within the application really contributes to our understanding of one or more of those three key aspects and elements that we're looking for. And I'll try to point that out as we go through the individual components. We also believe strongly that bringing in a diverse group of candidates across different backgrounds, different geographies, different interests and experiences is essential to creating the kind of community that lives our mission of educating leaders for business and society. So we believe that students from a really wide range of backgrounds and experiences and circumstances can thrive at SOM. So throughout our application process, we're looking to understand more about your background and the environmental factors as one aspect of your candidacy that can inform those three major areas that I highlighted. So with that, if you'll give me just a moment, I'm going to open up the application itself, which is live, and we'll begin our walkthrough. All right, so let me give that just a moment to catch up. All right, so with that, we'll start with the instructions, everyone's favorite part of an application. But actually, for real, it is one of my favorite parts, because as much as I'm thrilled that you're all here to join me today, we've very intentionally put everything within the application itself that you could possibly need to complete a successful application. We've been really thoughtful and thorough about walking you through what we're looking for, why we're looking for it, and how to go about answering the questions in a really thoughtful way. So I will encourage you to spend some time with the instructions we did, and I think it will really help kind of guide you through when you open up an application and go through this live. But as we start here in the instruction page, a couple of things that I'll point out. So first off, I'll say we do have a sliding scale application fee structure, as well as a number of different categories for which we offer fee waivers. Sliding scale application fee is based on level of income that you'll enter in the employment section. So we are sensitive to that people are coming from different economic backgrounds and want to make the application more accessible, application process more accessible to everyone with that. You'll see here very important application dates. And so I'll note, in addition to the 3 application deadlines for rounds 1, 2, and 3, there's also what we call a post-submission materials deadline. So there's a few things that I'll mention at the end of our walkthrough that come after you hit submit, namely our behavioral assessment and our video questions. And so you'll just want to keep in mind you have a couple of extra days beyond the deadline to get those completed, but you're not quite done once you've hit submit. Another thing I'll call out on this page is our statement on AI. We got a lot of questions about use of AI in the application process, and is it allowed, and should I do it? And rather than place a universal prohibition on something that we're all using in our daily lives in a variety of ways, we've instead decided to include a statement of more guidance on how we expect and recommend that you do and don't use AI. So in a nutshell, I'll say your application needs to be your own. It should be your own ideas in your own voice. If using AI helps you brainstorm or helps you refine your ideas or helps you polish a final product, to make sure you don't have spelling mistakes the same way that you would use a human being to help with those sorts of things at the very end, that's totally fine. But the ideas and the content really need to be your own. Certainly in the written components. And when it comes to the spoken components of your application, we'll get a little bit more into that when we talk about video questions and interviews later, but I'll simply say, don't use it. It will never be to your benefit to use AI in lieu of your own sort of genuine articulation of your thoughts. So that's what I'll leave with AI for right now. And from there, I'm going to skip over, very important, but you'll sign a statement of honesty before heading into the rest of your application. I'm not going to dive into personal information. It's basically just your general kind of demographic info, not too much additional insight to share there. But I think the next section that we'll head into kind of in tandem are your academic record and your test score, because these are 2 sections that we really look at holistically in order to get a sense of your academic preparation. I'll also mention a little bit later, the behavioral assessment is the 3rd piece of information we get about your academic preparation, but I'll get to that in a moment. So really using these 2 sections in tandem gives us a strong sense of your academic preparation to enter Yale SOM. And we really do use the 2 of them side by side, not in a particular weighting. The way that we're looking at this information will vary depending on your individual kind of background and circumstances. But starting with the academic record, this is a section where if you're going to skip over the instructions anywhere, please don't do it here. Issues with not giving us all of the necessary information for your transcripts and your academic history is the #1 reason why applications get held up in our review. So don't be one of those people who gets sort of stuck in the middle. Make sure you read really thoroughly what to do with all of the little idiosyncrasies that can pop up in an academic background, like study abroad and transfer credits. We go into a lot of detail about how to best present that information. So I won't go through it right now, but make sure you read that carefully. We'll ask you to report a GPA, but I do want to take this opportunity to stress you're more than just your GPA. We're looking at your entire academic history, all of the sorts of courses that you challenged yourself with, your trajectory. Have your grades improved over time, or have they not improved, whatever the case might be. But a GPA is one data point in time, but it doesn't capture the broader academic background and history that we're looking for within the questions that we have on this page for you. You'll see that in addition to reporting your institutions, your GPA, sharing your transcripts, we ask you a number of questions about your quantitative background. And I want to use this opportunity to stress that this is not a requirement of the program. We don't have any specific quantitative courses that we require you to have taken prior to coming into the program, but it is useful to understand your quantitative background and your capacity, and we'll do so in conjunction with the quantitative section of your GMAT or your GRE. So if you have less of a quantitative background, less exposure to the courses that are listed out here or other quantitative courses, we'll necessarily need to rely a little bit more heavily on the quantitative section of your testing because that's where we'll find the evidence. If you majored in one of these areas or have taken extensive coursework here, similarly, we'll rely a little bit less on the quantitative aspect of your GMAT or GRE. So that's an example of how, it's not a universal weighting across, but we are trying to kind of triangulate whether you've had a quantitative background to date or have demonstrated quantitative potential, because not surprisingly, the MBA degree does involve a fair bit of quantitative coursework. But the other thing we do with this information is we assess every student coming into the Yale School of Management for what we call Math Camp, which is actually taking place starting next week for the incoming class. So it's a preparatory sort of series of courses before orientation that will give people who have had less quantitative exposure or haven't had that exposure in a long time a little bit of a leg up moving into the program to make sure that everyone is coming in well prepared. So we'll use that information in that part of the process as well. Okay, the other thing I'll point out on this page is college seniors. So we do have a program called the Yale Silver Scholars Program that is meant for students directly graduating from their undergraduate experience. You can find more information about the program within this section. I won't go into a ton of depth here, but it is extremely important that you identify as a college senior, if that's in fact the case, because it will prompt a slightly different version of the work experience section that will come later. And we want to make sure that you're answering the correct set of questions there, because obviously for college seniors, your work experience to date will look quite different from an MBA candidate who's coming in with previous work experience. Okay, so that's what I'd like to highlight on the academic record page. And as I mentioned, we're looking at this in tandem with test scores. So we do require a GMAT or a GRE from every candidate. We don't have a waiver process. But as I said, the GMAT and the GRE is not a sort of standalone piece of information. We're using it in tandem with your academic history. We do require that all test scores be verified. So you'll self-report it within the application, but you'll need to have official scores sent to us by the post-submission materials deadline, which, as I mentioned, is just a couple days after the application deadline. So even better to get it in earlier rather than later. We ask that you include all of your scores. We'll, of course, credit you with your best sitting, but it's really helpful for us to understand progression, where you may have individual components that are higher in one score than the other. We do offer waitlist feedback, and so if we've seen that you've taken the test multiple times already, we may not recommend that you invest more energy in another retake. So it's useful for us to have all of that information, not just the final score that you want to report. Get a lot of questions about, can you send new test scores after the deadline? The answer is yes, but we can't guarantee that anything comes in after the deadline is going to be kind of included in your review, depending on where you are in the review process. We'll always do our best to integrate any new information, but just make sure you get that to us as quickly as possible so we have the best chance of including it. And then the last thing I'll say on testing is, on our class profile, we include a median and then a range of 80% range of scores of people in the class. But I would say treat this as a true range. If you fall outside the range, it's not a deal breaker. But as I said before, this really interacts with your academic record from undergraduate or any other graduate studies. And so if your testing is not as strong as where you'd want it to be, you're very likely going to need the academic history to compensate then for that. But the profile is a good sense, again, to get an idea of those ranges. So that kind of rounds out the bulk of the academic sort of assessment, although, like I said, I'll talk a little bit about the behavioral assessment later on. So these next couple of sections that we're going to head into are really starting to lay the groundwork for understanding your professional impact. So I would think about the work experience, post-MBA interests, and recommendations all as contributing to our understanding of your work experience and also your forward-looking aspirations. So starting with work experience, again, you're going to want to make sure if you're a college senior that you've clicked the right checkbox on the previous page, so you'll get that version of it. But what I'll say is the work experience section is really, it's a combination of the resume that you'll provide us. And we do give you a template, which is the Yale SOM official template that all of our students use. You don't need to use that template by any means. We just want to give you an option there. But however you best want to represent your activity within a resume is an important piece of that. But the other important piece, and I think opportunity really that we give you, are these individual work entries. And this is an opportunity really to connect the dots in a way that sometimes a resume can't, to help us understand the transitions you've made between roles. It helps equalize a little bit too. We have an experienced team who's been reviewing MBA job paths for a long time, but we don't know every company in the world and we don't know every position that's out there. So in order to kind of standardize that a bit and not create a bias just towards organizations that we're more familiar with, we give you an opportunity, in addition to some just the basic information about your role, we give you an opportunity to provide a company description, a brief description of your role, and if you've had multiple roles within an organization, you can share your most recent one. And then what I think can be incredibly informative is this reason for leaving. So this is an opportunity to tell us why you've made the moves that you have in a way that a resume is really hard to kind of communicate that kind of message. So the really unhelpful things to put in this section is got a new opportunity or took a new job, because that's obvious to us. But give us a little bit of your rationale and help kind of tell your story to help us understand your trajectory a little bit better there. The other thing I'll point out in this section is if you are the founder of a company, we have a special set of questions just for you. We've worked closely with our Dean of Entrepreneurship at Yale SOM to develop a suite of questions that really help us understand and appreciate your entrepreneurial experiences. And so you'll answer these additional questions that, again, will give us the context to better interpret an entrepreneurial experience that we may not be as familiar with. Okay. Let's see. I will also mention two other things that are worth noting here, and again, help us kind of connect the dots in a way, is gaps in work experience. So we ask everyone to identify if you've had a gap of 3 or more months of unemployment, or if you're currently unemployed. This is not a red flag. This is not a ding against you. Lots of people have pauses in their work for any variety of reasons, but rather than have us guess at what that is or make up our own stories, we give you an opportunity to lay that out here in a straightforward way, which is really helpful. And then a little bit ahead of the next section in choice of recommenders, actually, I'll pivot to talking about recommenders a little bit as well, because that's another piece of understanding your work history. So as long as you are not a silver scholar, and that's a sort of a separate set of instructions. So for our typical entry, applicants will ask you to provide 2 letters of recommendation. And my guidance there is to think about recency and think about proximity. So recency is the more recent to your current day experience, the better, because it's more of a indicator of who you are today in the workplace. And then proximity, we're really looking ideally for someone who has supervised you directly. So someone who has regular interactions with you and is responsible in some way for your assessment and your development. So in thinking about those 2 things, a current supervisor is obviously the ideal intersection of the 2, but we recognize for a variety of reasons why that might not be possible or preferable. So this is your opportunity to tell us why that is. And again, it's not going to be an automatic ding against you by any means not to have a current supervisor, but rather than have us speculate as to why you don't have that represented, this is an opportunity for you to share that information with us. Okay. So I'll move from there to post-MBA interests. So that work experience page is really the backwards looking piece of your work experience. And I would say probably the most important thing is the work that you've already done. Less important, but still relevant, is sort of your forward-looking aspirations. And I say less important because we know how many people change their mind once they come into an MBA program. So we're not going to hold you to this and say you can only recruit for the thing that you wrote in your application. But we do want to know that you've given this whole process some thought. You've come up with a area of interest that's guiding you towards this investment in your education in an MBA. And so we want to hear about that here. And so this is an opportunity. It's not an essay. It's a really short, 200 words is not much more than this paragraph that you're seeing right here. So it's a very brief statement around what are your career interests and how have you arrived at them. So in that, we want to hear a little bit about what have you already done to pursue those interests and what do you need to do going forward. And again, this doesn't need to be an essay. This is just a brief statement that covers, what are the things that led you to these interests and what's going to help you further develop them. Okay. Oh, I should mention here briefly, we do have a number of joint degree programs, I think 10 with different programs across Yale. If you are applying to a joint degree, it's always going to be 2 separate admissions processes with those individual schools. But given that that may play heavily into your decision to pursue an MBA, we do give you an opportunity to give us a little bit more information here about your decision to pursue a joint degree. But again, 2 separate application processes and 2 separate admissions outcomes from each of those schools that might be involved. Okay, I mentioned recommendations already, so I don't think I'll go into much more depth on here. Again, just remember proximity and recency are good good directions to go by. And we have a lot of resources online as well about where to go for recommendations if your obvious choices are not available to you. So I'm going to keep going on this front. And now we start getting into sections that I think could contribute to our understanding of a few different areas. So we ask you about your activities. This may give us some sense of your community involvement. We ask you to call out your 2 most sort of meaningful activities during your time as an undergrad, and then 2 most meaningful activities during your time after undergrad. And we limit it to 2 because we really want to focus in on the things that have been most meaningful and that you've most deeply dedicated yourself to. So you'll have an opportunity to tell us a little bit about that here. And I really encourage you to think broadly about activities. So it can be things that come to mind like volunteer work or extracurriculars, but it can also be hobbies or familial obligations, or it's really meant to capture all of the things that you have dedicated yourself to. It could be work for earning income during the time you're in school. So think broadly about the things that you've dedicated yourself to, because that will really, again, help us build a more comprehensive picture of who you are and what your circumstances have been. All right. Moving on to the essay. So the essay can really inform any number of aspects of your candidacy, depending on where you go with it. So briefly, we have 1 required essay, and you have a choice of 3 different prompts to answer the essay. And in my mind, they're really all in some ways getting at the same thing. So the prompts are broadly, describe the biggest commitment you have ever made, describe the community that's been most meaningful to you, and describe the most significant challenge you've faced. And so they're all slightly different questions, but what they're all getting at is asking you to reflect on something that has been really significant in your life and the way that you approached it. So I actually think far more important than the topic you choose is the care you kind of take in describing your approach to that commitment, that community, or that challenge. We're big believers here at SOM that the best predictors of how you'll behave in the future is how you've behaved in the past. And so we're looking to understand how you've learned from and responded to past experiences. not just what your future aspirations are. And so that's really where I would dedicate your focus and attention here. But obviously thinking about topic is sort of the first step of this process. And so what I would say is if you ask yourself the question, what's most important to me? What have my most meaningful experiences or efforts been? My guess is that 2 or 3 things come to your mind immediately. That's where you're going to want to pick from. You don't need to overthink this and craft the perfect topic. You want to pick something that is genuinely meaningful to you because that's where you're going to have the most content to write a meaningful essay. So of those 2 or 3 things that come to mind, pick the one that you feel like you're going to have the easiest time writing about, and that's going to be most comfortable for you. Again, don't worry about being memorable or unique. We're really looking more for that approach than that you've got some topic that we've never heard of before. I get a lot of questions about, is it better to write about something personal or professional? And I don't actually think there's a better way to go. What I will encourage you to do, though, or push you to do is you get a lot of opportunities to talk about your professional experience already within the application. And so I would push yourself to say, is there something beyond what I've already shared that I want to highlight through the essay? And it's okay if the answer is no, or if your response, is something that connects deeply to you beyond your work, but it touches upon your work again. And don't get overly hung up on this. But once again, this is an opportunity to go beyond the content that we're getting from the rest of your application. So I would push you to think about, are you sharing kind of new and deeper information here than we've already gotten from you elsewhere? Proofread. This is an area where, again, you're totally in the clear if you want to use AI to make sure you're sending us an essay that has the right school name in it and has the right, right punctuation and things like that. You want to make sure that you're sharing, as professionally put together a work product here as possible. This isn't you're not entering a writing or a literature program, which is why I'm a little bit less concerned about, saying absolutely no AI use here. But again, something that AI generates is just not going to be as authentic and individual to you. So I really encourage you to draft this on your own. And if you're going to use AI, do it the same way that you would a friend who's looking at your essay and saying, I think this is ready to go. I'll mention also within this section, so that's the required essay. If you are a reapplicant, we will ask you to give us a brief reapplicant kind of update. It's not even really an essay, but just sharing and highlighting what are the specific things that have changed about your application since the last go around, but also highlight the optional information section here. And the optional information is really, truly optional. If there is nothing additional that needs to be shared beyond what we've given you an opportunity to quite expansively kind of report on, this is totally fine for it to be blank. The litmus test I'd use for this section is if something that we have asked you about requires more explanation than we've given you opportunity to kind of provide in the sections that we've given, this is the place to do it. So one frequent thing that comes up here is academic information. If you had particular challenges during some aspect of your academic journey that you want to give us some contextual information around, this is an opportunity to do that as an example. But it's definitely not an opportunity to write an essay that we haven't asked you to do, for instance. That's not a good use of the optional statement. All right, as we're rounding out sort of the back end of the application here, the last section here, which is entirely optional, but I highly encourage you to take advantage of filling out, is background information. So as I mentioned at the top, we're looking for a class that comes from all kinds of different backgrounds and circumstances and experiences. And this is an opportunity to give us a little bit more of a window into that experience for you. So we'll ask some questions about your parents are primary caregivers, which gives us information about, for instance, are you a first-generation college student, about kind of your childhood and where you grew up, about your family. And again, we're trying to get a more comprehensive picture of who you are, where you're coming from. We tried to be thoughtful in the sorts of questions we ask, but if there's anything that you feel would be relevant for us to know that we haven't asked you about, or you want to give us more information about what we have asked you about, you have this supplemental kind of detail section at the very bottom. Because again, we're really looking to get as thorough an understanding of who you are and what you want us to know as possible. So that brings us through sort of what you will submit within your application. And I mentioned there's a couple things that come post-application that I'll mention briefly before we open it up for questions. So the two main things I'll highlight that are due by that post-submission materials deadline are the behavioral assessment and the video questions. So the behavioral assessment is an online admissions tool. It's administered by ETS. And it looks at a set of interpersonal and intrapersonal competencies that are associated with business school success. So what that means is we're looking for a set of traits that we know are associated with success in business school above and beyond what traditional things like GMATs and GREs and academics can predict. And so boiling it down, what this is really helping us do is take a chance on candidates who may not present the strongest academic backgrounds on those traditional metrics, but who we know have a lot to contribute to an MBA classroom. And so we're looking for an additional way to understand whether whether you have kind of what it takes above and beyond those traditional metrics to perform well in the classroom. And we've studied this with ETS over time. We use it with a relatively light touch. This is not something that you need to stress out over or prepare in any way, but it's really meant to help us boost candidates who, again, for a variety of reasons, may not have had the strongest academic presentation, but who have indicators that they will be able to do well here. What it actually is it is an online kind of module. It takes about 20 or 25 minutes to complete. Should be done in a single setting. You don't need to do anything in advance to prepare. It doesn't require any specialized knowledge or background. What we'll essentially do is present you with a series of paired statements. So it might be something like, I like to go to meetings and I'm a very organized person. And you pick the one that feels more like you. And it may be, neither feels particularly like you, or they both feel a lot like you. Don't stress. You're going to go through about 130 of these paired statements. No one answer that you give is going to be determinative of your outcome at SOM. In fact, even as a whole, your performance on the behavioral assessment is not going to determine your outcome in this process. It is a supplemental piece of information that we're using. I actually think it's kind of fun to take. I really want to stress this should not be a source of anxiety for you, but just make sure you have 20, 25 minutes set aside to dedicate to this after you've submitted your application. And then alongside that, we have our video questions. So these were actually originally developed over a decade ago to help us assess English language skills. So if you are a non-native English speaker, we don't require any kind of TOEFL or IELTS or anything like that. We use our video questions. And on top of that, more generally, we would like to get a sense of how you articulate yourself on your feet, which is a useful skill to have in an MBA classroom and arguably in life more generally. So you'll get 2 randomized previously recorded questions asked by a member of the admissions team. So you probably won't get the exact same questions as anyone else who's in this webinar today, but you'll get 2 questions from our kind of question banks. And then after you hear each one stated, you'll have 60 seconds to deliver a response. So my recommendations here is become familiar with the time frame. Depending on who you are, 60 seconds can go by in a flash or it can feel like an eternity. So just get familiar with what it feels like to speak on a video to yourself for 30 seconds. You'll have opportunity to practice with the tool. So there's plenty of practice questions you can do, so you won't have to worry about kind of being familiar with the technology or the format. Make sure you have a good, quiet, private space to do this. We always get a kick out of seeing your cats and your roommates crossing the screen, but it's probably going to throw you off your game. And then I'll say the worst possible mistake you can make on these video questions is reading off of notes, or even worse, plugging something real quick into AI and getting a AI generated statement. I promise you that no matter how imperfect your response is, it's going to be 1,000,000 times better if it is naturally produced and an authentic kind of articulation of your response versus something that you're reading off of a script somewhere. So this is a place where I'd say hard no on AI. The last thing I'll mention then is interviews. So interviews are by invitation only. So everyone that we admit will be invited to interview, but we send out interview invitations throughout the entire round. And in fact, throughout the entire cycle, the majority of our interviews are conducted by second-year students. So you'll have a really nice touch point with somebody within the school. And our team is sort of a backup if we need more capacity. But hopefully you'll have a chance to interact with the second year through that process. Even though the interview kind of appears last in terms of the work that you need to do to apply, it's really not an up or down decision. I promise you that an interview is one small slice of what we're looking at comprehensively across your application. And so it's not as though, the decision is being made in those 30 minutes. Hopefully that takes a little bit of the pressure off. So that's a quick but hopefully comprehensive overview of the application process. Again, we're really looking to understand that academic preparedness, your professional impact and potential, and how you operate within communities and organizations. And we're looking at all of these things in tandem to help us get at that information. So I think it's probably a good time to open it up to questions, Braden.
Yeah, hooray. Thank you so much. Lots of awesome information. So thank you for that, Laura.
Yeah.
So if you'd like to raise your hands, I see one individual already has their hand raised. So raise your hand and come off of mute. I'll invite you to come off of mute after calling on you. And then you can also come off camera if you'd like to ask your questions. So and I'm going to apologize in advance for any mispronunciation of names. So Sapana Patil, would you like to come off and ask your question?
Yeah, hi, Laurel. Thank you so much for this session.
Absolutely.
I have a question about transfer. So I saw some information written on the PPT, what you are presenting. So if you can just explain the transfer point here. Something was written regarding the transfer.
So specifically, I think what you're referring to was if you transferred schools as an undergraduate or
Yeah.
potentially graduate school. Yeah. So rather than having to sort of get incomplete information about your academic record, we have really detailed advice and instructions on how to present your own individual journey. So what it really comes down to is we need every single course name and every single grade that you've received as an undergraduate. And so sometimes that will all appear on a final transcript from the school that issues your degrees, and sometimes it won't. Sometimes they'll just show credits or the course names won't be there. So if that's the case, we'll need that original transcript from the school that you took those grades at. And so that's one of those things that's really good to do the legwork in advance of opening up, an application a day or two before it's due, because it might require reaching out to a school that you attended 10 years ago and tracking something down.
Okay, but the transfer is possible. That's what you're saying, right?
So if during your undergraduate degree you transferred from one school to the next, that's fine. We don't accept, and it's a slightly different question, I'm not sure if you're asking, we don't accept transfer students for an MBA into the program. So for instance, if you completed your first year of an MBA program at another school and want to transfer that into Yale SOM, that's not a possibility.
But I think the fresh start is possible. The transfer is
Yes.
not possible in MBA.
Exactly.
Fresh transfer is possible.
Yes.
The fresh start is possible. It's like any other candidate.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Right. Thank you for your question. It looks like Krunal Thakar, would you like to come off and ask your question, please?
Sure. Thanks. Thank you so much, Laurel. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Yes.
For the presentation. My question was, if someone has had extenuating circumstances during their undergrad degree and hasn't been able to get good undergraduate scores but has a really good GMAT, are there any recommended remediations that the applicant can do to offset those?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so I think, the first point that you've already made, being able to demonstrate strength through your testing will be particularly important if we can't rely as much on your undergraduate record. So it sounds like you've already got that piece of it covered. I think in addition, I don't like to send people to do courses just for the sake of admission. So I give this advice more broadly. I think preparation going into any MBA program with solid exposure to microeconomics and statistics is universally useful. So if that's by chance coursework that you haven't had or haven't done as well in, and you want to demonstrate some academic proficiency, those are ones that I would focus on, because again, I think it'll benefit you greatly within any MBA program versus just saying, oh, go take some random math class and show us that you've got that proficiency. So I think that's another area. And then I think using that optional statement potentially to give us some additional context under your performance. I'm not saying everyone has a explicit reason or excuse or anything like that, but if you do have, again, context that will allow us to understand your undergraduate trajectory better than a transcript alone, that's where I invite you to share that.
Sure. Thank you so much. That really helps. Thanks.
All right, thank you. So now popping over to the chat, I'm going to generalize this question from Karanjot. So it talks about maybe how the Yale School of Management views a founder instead of somebody from the corporate world starting their own business, innovation, things like that. How would that be viewed compared to a more traditional work experience on an application?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly welcome people from all kinds of professional backgrounds, including founders, and it was really a big driver of why we worked with our Dean of Entrepreneurship to build out a separate set of questions, because we wanted to make sure we were giving people with less traditional backgrounds and founder backgrounds every opportunity to showcase their journey and their achievements in that space. And I should stress you don't need to be a successful founder. Obviously, we know that many entrepreneurial ventures do not end up in, you've produced a unicorn. We recognize there's a lot of value in the experience of being an entrepreneur, even if it wasn't traditionally successful. So I think that's a great background to have. I'll speak frankly, I wish we had more entrepreneurs interest in business school writ large. I think you hear about the successful ones, but I think business schools are a great place to build broadly applicable entrepreneurial skills, and I think they're not always the obvious choice for someone who's already in the entrepreneurial space. So I'd certainly say, at least at our school, we highly encourage those backgrounds and would love to see more of it.
Awesome, thank you. So we have about 2 minutes left. So if it's okay with you, do we take one? If we take one more question, Laurel, is that all right?
Sure, yeah.
All right, Pratik, would you like to come off of mute and ask your question, please?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Hey, hi, Laurel, and thank you for this lovely session.
Sure.
I'm sorry the video is off because it's pretty late night in India.
That's okay.
Yeah. So,
thanks for staying
my
up.
question, yeah, thank you. My question was like based on the previous question asked by Krunal. So you talked about like showing your proficiency in subjects like statistics and microeconomics. So for example, if I have a low GPA, but I have high grades in stats and quants, so is that something which might fall in my favor? And to add on to that, if my GMAT score is average, but my quant score is, for example, perfect score, like a 90 on 90 or like 88, something on those sorts. So can this help me like compensate for the low GPA?
I think you're probably not going to be surprised to hear me say it kind of all depends on the specifics. So one thing I will say is, even though we talked a fair amount about kind of quantitative preparation, I don't want to give the impression that that's the only thing that matters. We are looking across the board. So I think if there's room to improve testing when you're trying to overcome a weaker academic history, if you think that studying more, retaking will be helpful, I'd always encourage you to do it. It certainly can't hurt, and we are looking more broadly than just quantitative preparation. And if, as you mentioned, you have been able to demonstrate quantitative proficiency in your undergraduate coursework, it sounds like you have that aspect covered. And so maybe it does make sense to focus a little bit more on making sure your verbal side of things is demonstrating what you want it to, or depending on the test that you're taking.
Thank you very much.
So I think it's hard to say without seeing an application in full, and you're thinking in the right ways that there are kind of checks and balances. But what I would say is, we are focusing on more than just quantitative preparation. So bear that in mind.
Sure. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. So thank everyone for joining the Yale School of Management session. Let's give a big thank you to Laurel for taking the time to join us today and provide us with information to be successful when we apply to the Yale School of Management. We hope this session helps you feel more confident as you prepare for the application. Best of luck to everyone on their MBA journey. Thanks everyone for joining. Thank you so much, Laurel. Everyone have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.